Good morning, everybody. Whether here in the auditorium or online, welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Andrew Redman, the director of the Mexico Institute, and it's our great pleasure to welcome you to the kickoff of our 11th annual Security Conference. Security is, of course, one of the most pressing issues in the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship, and it likely will be for the foreseeable future. The 100,000 deaths from opioids in the United States, primarily from fentanyl in the last year, makes drug trafficking a significant domestic issue. In Mexico, drug cartel violence, often using weapons procured from the United States, places innocent civilians in harm's way and undermines Mexico's ability to attract investment essential for economic growth and development. Addressing these and other related challenges which confront our governments and societies requires cross-border collaboration. Our governments have committed under the bicentennial framework to such collaboration in recognition of the shared challenges. Just a note, we had hoped to have the opportunity to hear from senior officials from both governments this morning. Scheduling difficulties prevented that from happening today, but we're going to continue to be in contact with them and hope that we can do that sometime soon. When we talk about security, we shouldn't limit ourselves to focusing solely on drug cartels and cross-border flows of drugs and weapons. It's equally important to talk about personal security for Mexicans, frequently identified as the #1 concern of voters in the upcoming Mexican election. The high rates of impunity and of violence, including against journalists and against women, and rising reports of extortion impact the daily lives of Mexican citizens countrywide. During our conference, spread out over 2 days and combining in-person and virtual platforms, we'll address both the international and the domestic aspects of security. Our speakers and panels will focus on the challenges facing both countries, separately and collectively, and on possible solutions to reduce or eliminate the threats to our peace, prosperity, and security. We'll kick off this morning with a presentation by Pablo Vázquez, Secretary of Citizen Security of Mexico City, who I'll introduce momentarily. Secretary Vázquez will provide a real-time perspective on how Mexican public officials respond to the diversity of threats to public security. Following the Secretary's remarks, former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico and current Wilson Center Public Policy Fellow, Ambassador Earl Anthony Wayne, will moderate a panel on strategies to combat illicit trafficking. It's important to recall that the cartels and other criminal organizations will traffic anything for which there is an illicit market. We hope that in discussing several of these products, we can identify some commonalities of strategy and best practice. 2024 is, as I mentioned, an election year in Mexico and in the United States, of course. Tomorrow will be entirely virtual for a panel that will look at the security challenges facing Mexico's next president, whomever she or he may be. We subsequently hope to host representatives of the campaigns to hear about their plans and strategies once the campaign officially begins, effective this Friday, March 1st. In addition, we have several analytical pieces on security issues on our elections guide website, which can be found at mexicoelections.wilsoncenter.org. Now, with apologies to our translators for switching in the middle, es ahora mi gran placer de presentar el secretario
For us, it's our pleasure to introduce the Pablo Vázquez, Secretary of Security in Mexico City, and he assumed 6 months ago his position. He used to be in charge of the Undersecretary of Citizen Participation and Prevention of Crime, where he implemented programs to reduce violence, alto al fuego, and reconnecting with peace also. Before, he also had various positions in the federal government, such as head of the Violence and Crime Prevention Unit of the Secretariat of Security and Citizen Protection for the government of Mexico. Also, General Director of Crime Prevention and Community Services for the Attorney General's Office, and also Director of Research and Strategies for Social Prevention of the Undersecretary of Prevention and Citizen Participation, again in the Ministry of the Interior, Gobernación. Before, he was also in charge of different projects of crime prevention, money laundering, and identifying of operational risks and in the private sector also. He has a BA in International Relations from the ITAM. And if I'm not mistaken, he was actually a student of Duncan Wood, our vice president. He also has a master's in criminal policy for the London School of Economics, and he also has specialization studies in organized crime in Sicily and Macedonia. This information is also available on his website. So thank you and welcome to the Wilson Center, and go ahead with your presentation, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I will switch briefly to Spanish. Just wanted to thank the Mexico Institute and the Wilson Center for the invite and all the attendants for sharing your time to listen and to comment on what Mexico City has done in terms of security in the last 5 years with the strategy that I will refer briefly that was first implemented by Dr. Sheinbaum, now one of the candidates to the presidency, and that it's being continued now by the chief of government, Martí Batres, and a strategy that was implemented in close connection with the government, the federal government, and of course, local governments. I'll switch to Spanish. I want to thank also and congratulate myself and the rest of the panelists for this session. Kathleen, Austin, Jim Vivenzo, and of course Raúl Benítez, a dear friend and mentor. It's an honor to share the panel, and also thanking Duncan Wood. I was indeed, in fact, his student back in the day in the ITAM. Me voy a referir entonces rápidamente.
And so briefly, I'm going to refer now to the strategy for security that we have implemented in Mexico City. And as always, just to confirm that you can see my screen, right? The slides. Yes, confirmed. Thank you. So the strategy for Mexico City, which was designed, as I mentioned, by Dr. Sheinbaum, Claudia Sheinbaum, consists of 4 main pillars expressed in the screen that you can see here. This is our most simplest or simplified version, and I will talk about these individually and then present some results I have obtained. The first one has to do with addressing the causes, atención a las causas, addressing the causes. This is a pillar that has to do, and that actually goes beyond what we worked normally in terms of crime prevention. This is a pillar that, first of all, creates the commitment that all of the crime in terms of perpetration of crimes has many times to do with structural factors, with inequality, with exclusion, and also with the lack of access of persons to services and programs that may allow them to guarantee rights, among them the right to justice. We have been focused here in addressing the youth, in several dimensions. For example, we have worked a lot with education, people in Mexico City, guaranteeing that from the beginning until college, there is a continuum line in terms of services that are also free and universal for young people who can have access to education in the first stages until college. And we have built universities also. We have also broadened access to high schools. We have worked with the Federal Education Ministry, which is in charge of basic education, in offering then also grants for students so that they don't desert and abandon schools. This was during the pandemic, where we had to struggle scholar or academic desertion or dropouts. We have also implemented a community education system, which are the Pilares, which offer technical education. And this is not academic education necessarily, but then these are also facilities that are very high quality in terms of the architecture, also that is very present in certain neighborhoods that have large or high marginalization rates. And also we have programs that are more focused on young people in high-level situations, high-level risk situations. One of them has to do with Jóvenes Unen al Barrio, which is a monetary transfer for young people so that they can include and have access to certain activities, and another one is coordinated by the Secretary of Citizen Security, which has to do with coordinating, is a pretrial diversion program. And what we do there is, instead of them going to trial, they have a certain activity when they are free, when they have been detained for minor crimes or felonies. We also work in interventions that have to do with behavioral attitudes so that we can struggle and actually prevent crime. This impact has allowed us also to establish that young people that have gone to Reconecta have a 10 times lower probability of reincidents, criminal reincidents, compared to a similar group of young people who didn't have access to this program. So there are many initiatives here, and I insist on this. They fight exclusion, inequality, and offering programs and services based on information that allow people to exercise their rights. This is a summarized way to put this. And this is then the second pillar, Más y Mejor Policía, so more and better police. It has to do with strengthening police in Mexico City. Also, the incorporation that I am honored to lead has right now the Policía Preventiva, which is a preventive police that everybody sees in the streets, what we call complementary complementary police that offer services under certain agreements. And this is also 86,000 force. And perhaps the most important element here that I would highlight is that never before in these 5 years, we have been able to increase the income of police officers and increase their income significantly. In nominal rates, we can say that this increase has been of 68% for police income, and Mexico City police officers went from being one of the worst paid police on the state level to the fourth best paid countrywide or nationwide. And we don't need much more to be placed as the best paid state police in the country. We had a drawback, taking into account also the living standards in Mexico City in terms of their salaries, but we have also done something else. We have also fought the deficit in terms of personnel. We have also reinforced recruitment and improved ongoing training for police officers. We have also designed two specific profiles to enter the police that we didn't have before, that have to do with the next pillar of the strategy, which is the regular profile and also intelligence and research or investigation. This has to do with the third pillar, intelligence and investigation, and also by receiving the penitentiary system, we have a certain profile for this penitentiary system. And then we have ongoing training that is also required by the national security policy. And we have also highlighted our ongoing training in Mexico City for police officers. We have been offered also help by foreign institutions or sending our police officers to different countries for certain specialties. This is also complemented by a great work that has been done in terms of reducing gaps of inequality within the police force. We have also more executive police officers that are female, and 1 year ago we had the first generation of our university. They graduated, and we had more women than men in our recruits, and we have also created a special unit, actually, that we have just initiated an amendment in Congress, but we have this internal affairs unit created that recently against focusing also on violence against women, and we have been reinforcing this unit, and this is now a public policy unit to attain substantial equality. There are much more developments that we could talk about, but I believe Mexico City hasn't reinforced a triangle of institutional functions that are basic for a good functioning of a state police, especially in the context of our country, which has to do with having tactic units that are very strong, investigative units also that have to be enforced, and also specialized personnel in urban interventions. And the next pillar is intelligence and investigation, the third pillar. So the secretariat that received in 2020 formally with a law amendment that was presented in 2019, the ability to investigate. These are one of the few police forces that has this capacity. And it was written in law, the faculty of being able to investigate, in addition to offering support to attorney general offices, which is of course in charge of this investigation, but we then offered the police force the ability to prevent and to investigate preventively. This is the main attribution that we could highlight, and we have then also become more functional for the Attorney General's office. We then notify in a preventive manner these investigations, so we have a judicial file that has been initiated, and after this has been done, we also have the possibility of offering information to the Secretariat, or in simpler terms, they can ask us for support to investigate certain cases. And this, of course, without going into quality or other processes, we can say that in terms of arithmetic, we could say that this can be translated into the fact that right now in Mexico City, there are 4 times more police officers investigating crimes than there used to be at the beginning of this administration in 2018 and 2019. This doesn't mean that the 86,000 police officers, they investigate cases, but no, there are certain areas that have been created within the Secretariat that do investigation, complete cases, and that investigate also based on specialty of felonies, crime, extortion, kidnapping, and these are also high impact crimes. We also have specialized units working on field based on tactic analysis, and in addition to this, people that are also deployed in the field work are police officers. They investigate, and this is then integrated in the investigations that are centralized. This has also allowed to reduce significantly the impunity levels in Mexico City. Perhaps if we measure impunity under a simple measurement where we see that each file or every felony, there's a sanction for each crime or felony, this is not reflected in the reduction of impunity levels. But if we focus on a more strategic level and we, for example, talk about how many people have applied violence or that we know of in terms of our intelligence that have applied violence, that are detained, arrested, not maybe because of that particular crime or homicide that they committed, but maybe for another felony or crime as extortion or as a felony that has to do with a drug-related crime, we have then seen that we have managed to detain, arrest people, a lot of people that generate violence, and we have used identifiers to be able to illustrate our work. And for many violence generators, we have taken them to prison, and their cases or the cases specific of violence are still being investigated. And finally, the issue of coordination, the fourth pillar. This has been fundamental in Mexico City by integrating the operations between the Attorney General's office and the police. This is something that we haven't seen before in the past Mexico City, and many times we don't see this in the rest of our national territory, where we have thanks to these investigative capacities, we can have a coordinated work and more functional and completely integrated with the Attorney General's office. The most important, this is the most important pillar, but also with other institutions that have been very important for Mexico City, for example, Centro Nacional de Inteligencia, National Intelligence Center, Marina, Guardia Nacional, and also, of course, integrating on a federal level a lot of social work, grassroots work by designing programs that have both tools, social and by dissociating crime, and that share a lot of information between these two strategies. One of them has to do with Alto Fuego ceasefire, which is an adaptation of the ceasefire plan that was carried out in many cities of the US. This has been carried out in Mexico City successfully and also has been accompanied with organizations from civil society from the US, California Partnership for Safe Communities, and also Innovation Supporting Action, and then other also that we have worked with. So these are the pillars of our strategy, and I can also introduce some of the results right now. In terms of high impact crimes, this is a jointly analysis of 10 crimes that we measure from the beginning of administration. These are 12 crimes that we observe that have a high impact because of their violence or else because of it has an impact on the daily lives of people. We have homicide, injuries, extortion, rape, We then also have theft, grand theft, and the aggregate of these most important felonies or crimes that have to do with the perception of violence within society. In January of this year, which was the last count that we had, they had the lowest levels since we have this history, and 52 is the average of crimes that are committed in Mexico City, or to be precise, investigations being opened compared to the beginning of the administration. So these are some of the felonies or crimes that we have here in this compendium or compilation. We have had very important reductions in certain crimes and many felonies or crimes that were favored because of the pandemic. And we also had several important reductions during that period. They are very much associated with public activities. And this has been a reduction in the pandemic, also with the economic recovery. We have seen this. This is a graph about the homicides, reduction of 58% compared to January of 19 compared to 5 years ago. So the reduction is of 58%. We came from having from 5 homicides on a daily basis at the beginning of the administration to 2. 2 is the daily homicide rate that we have sustained throughout several months. In January 2024 was the fourth month with less homicides in the administration. In 2022, we had a month with 1.6 actually homicide rates per day. This has been the lowest homicide rate, matched with one that we had in previous years in 2005 or 2006. So the reduction of violence, homicides in Mexico City for a metropolis with these characteristics in Latin America, in many senses, is exceptional. And there have been, and I refer to this right now, before there's a lot of debate as to whether these figures have certain inconsistencies compared to the INEGI measures, compared to also the Attorney General's office. We then created a task force to address this issue, and there hasn't been any concealment, and we're not modifying the figures. No, that's not the case. So INEGI works with certain death certificates, and what we're seeing here are investigation cases. And what we have detected is there is a wrong or incomplete communication between these institutions to verify of these homicides. And also this has to do with the death certificates that are also generated in other states, which is the health ministry of these states. And after that, they're in charge of the necropsies, and they don't label these events as homicides, if they have certain doubts. And so they wait for the investigations to be completed to determine what is the case of death. And that's why we have this challenge between these two figures. But these are two different measurements that measure different things. On the one hand, we have death certificates. On the other one, we have investigation cases. And this is one of the causes for these differences. We have in Mexico City, for instance, in the last years, seen a reduction, a very important reduction, after having one of the most violent periods in Mexico City, which started with homicide rate increase in 2006. We also have black figures in these other, for example, grand theft figures with and without violence. We have minimal historics or minimum records here in Mexico City. And another thing that also allows us to reflect the work that we have been applying and realizing that the official records not necessarily have an echo of what people perceive is the perception of security in Mexico City. In absolute terms, we could say that a bit less than 50% still perceive insecurity in the city, and this then leads us to work even more. And with the ENSU INEGI survey, at the beginning of the administration, we talked about 9 out of 10 people in the city feeling unsafe, and this had reduced to 5 out of 10 in the last years. This, of course, has to do with the reduction of the investigative cases. And once again, the main has happened with victims rates. If we see the last record from the ENVIPE survey from 2022, we can also see a downward trend in the last years in terms of the victims rate, and this is maybe the figure that is most solid that we can have, where we can also see whether there are black figures or not. Of course, the magnitudes change because of this, but then when we ask people whether they have been victims of crime in the last years, we see that 2022 is reflecting the levels that we used to have in 2012 in this particular survey, which are the lowest ones that we have had since we have been implemented this survey by the INEGI, also in terms of prevalence of criminality measured by the victims survey from the INEGI. As I also mentioned, we have taken certain measures that are also important to address violence against women in terms of generated violence against women. There's a reduction of feminicides, and we also see that victims measured by INVIPE, this INEGI survey, in terms of rape, for example, has decreased, although we have an increase in the cases. There are a lot of black figures, and we can see that there's been a reduction because we have better mechanisms to place a complaint and to denounce people for this crime in particular. We have also seen this reflected in a reduction of the perception of insecurity, specifically talking for women in Mexico City. In the last years, we have seen a setback in the last years. Since 2021, this is when we have the launch of all these programs in Mexico City, and we have also recorded the level of perception that you see on that particular slide. To sum up, we have a four-pillar strategy that are interconnected between themselves, and our bet is to reinforce investigation. This has allowed us to offer these results, and this demands a lot of continuity to be able to delve deeper into what we have achieved. When we talk about a strategy, what we refer to this, well, it's a strategy that has to do with a reiteration of successful processes that are, of course, perfectible, but that also require continuity and consolidation to be effective. So thank you very much once again. Thank you, Secretary, and congratulations for the results that you offered us in this strategy in the last years. We don't have a lot of time, and I know that there's a complicated agenda also with you, but if I may ask you something, one question in particular, and I ask myself, given these successful results that you have shown for Mexico City, is there a possibility of sharing good practices, of implementing these strategies in other states, in other parts of the country? I believe so, yes. Undoubtedly, of course, the country is very diverse. Every territory has certain features or complexities. The same thing happens in Mexico City. It's not the same as having a central precinct compared to a southern borough. We have had these differences, but there are certain principles that we can adapt locally, undoubtedly, and there are also elements of the strategy that can have a translation or an implementation in different states, and this can offer also successful rates. The first thing that we can think of in Mexico is to stop talking about an overall strategy and start to think about particular, specific local strategies, obviously, of course, articulated and integrated and coordinated from the federal government. What has been successful in Mexico City is betting on the social impact with a universal perspective of inclusion, perspective of care, and this also combined with very focalized programs and informed and evidence-based programs. So the logic between a welfare state combined with focusing specifically on the social aspect, this has been very useful. And what has also been useful is to bet on investigation and put investigation in the center of our security strategy by strengthening the police capacities. This is not one single answer, but has been one answer that has offered us results. And within the actions that have to do with investigation, or we're talking about investigation, this has also to do with operational aspects and having very specific capacities within the police force that have been developed, as I mentioned, tactics and investigative functions to translate investigation into investigation cases, and also being able to intervene in a very dissuasive manner so we don't have any confrontation in urban interventions that we have. There's always confrontation in the end, right? But we have reduced them. And I also believe that the ability of being able to integrate our efforts in terms of the institutions to act and to act in these matters. I don't have any biases here, but I believe that our political leadership has opened spaces to be the referee of these actions and be able to also promote the exchange of information and the collaboration between different institutions and different teams. This has been done, but it's very important to have a space, in this case, the Security Cabinet, where have these relations that have been connected, coordinated, and we have designed the strategies with a political leadership that is very strong. So these three elements, I believe, are the ones that are very easy to replicate in other places, in addition to political decisions that are also important that have to do with investing in these matters, these issues. I talked about increasing the wages of police officers for 86,000 police officers. This is a decision that has to do with expenditure that can be made or not. But then, in addition to this, we have also prioritized in Mexico City the violence as the main element of the criminal policies. This is also a political decision has to be taken. So these are very easy to replicate, I would say. We might also find obstacles. We might also find facilities in every particular state, but as an active substance, I think these are elements that can be exported, of course. Thank you. Thank you once again, Mr. Secretary, for your assistance, and we hope that we can receive you in Washington in a in-person forum. But thank you for now very much for your time, and please an applause for Pablo Vasquez, the Secretary. Thank you.
Gracias. Hasta luego.
Thank you, on the contrary.
Hand the program over to our moderator, Ambassador Earl Anthony Wayne, who, as I mentioned before, is former ambassador to Mexico, a public policy fellow here at the Wilson Center, and also the co-chair of the advisory board of the Mexico Institute. So, Ambassador Wayne, thank you for being here, and over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I think we can have a very good conversation today, talking about preventing and combating illicit trade. There's a little bit of illicit trade to be prevented and combated, as we know, across this border. And we have three excellent specialists to talk with us here, who I'll introduce in just a minute. But just to put this in context, so there's $1.5 million of trade across that border every minute. So think of all the minutes you've already been here. So that's, $45–50 million worth of trade that's already gone across. There are 1 million people that cross the border every day. Some of them are the same people going across and coming back, but that's a lot of people. And they walk, they take trucks, they take buses. Some of them, go on other kind of vehicular traffic across there. That's a lot of people to pay attention to. And not surprisingly, they can take especially small, compact versions of valuable goods across that border, and then some bigger ones in different directions. So just for the one example that I've been following most closely in recent years is fentanyl. So between fiscal year 2018 and 2023, the amount of fentanyl seized at the U.S.-Mexico border was up 1,300%. And it was not all front packed. If you look at the last 3 fiscal years, FY 21 through 23, it was up 241%. And then if you say, okay, well, Mexico and the U.S. set up a high-level security dialogue, it had to get going and stuff, but now they have good cooperation, so this should be going down. Well, it actually rose. The amount of fentanyl seized at the border was up 84% between the last 2 fiscal years. So clearly, a lot of people are still moving fentanyl to the border, and I'm sure they're moving a lot of other things to the border that we don't we do pay attention to, but this is so deadly that we pay close attention to it. And we're going to hear a little bit about the money flows also. It's been estimated that the sales of these drugs in the United States make between 20 and 30 billion dollars a year. That's a lot of money. We don't find that money. We didn't find that money when I was ambassador to Mexico, and we haven't found it yet. A little bit of it crosses the border in cash, but not really that much. A lot of it is going through either trade-based money laundering, being invested in real estate, and other things, other ways. And despite the great skills of many of our officials looking into this, we really have not yet found much of that money. And it's somehow getting back to the people who provided these drugs. And then understandably, the government of Mexico is quite concerned about the amount of traffic in arms that is going across the border. We'll hear a little bit more about that. And the US and Mexico have finally restarted trying to collect data on this. It started during the Obama years and then really broke down for a while, and they're now looking at it more closely. So we'll get to hear a bit more about this. But about 50% of the arms seized were made in the United States, and another 18% were put together in the United States from parts that came from elsewhere, according to the data so far assembled by the two governments as they look at that. So, you know, it's a very serious problem, and we're going to look at it. And we haven't, you know, we're not really talking too much today about the human smuggling, but those doing the smuggling make a lot of money, bringing those migrants up who want to get across the border. And then the cartels quite often take a cut of that when they get to the border. In order to pass through their territory, they take a little cut also, which is again illicit funding for illicit traffic that's going back and forth on the border. So in any case, there's a lot of importance that we can talk about today. I think we have with us virtually Dr. Raul Benitez Mano, who's with us from he's a professor and researcher at the North American Research Center at UNAM in Mexico City. Thank you, Doctor. Gracias por su presencia con nosotros. We have Kathy Lynn Austin, who is Executive Director of the Conflict Awareness Project and joined us from California. Welcome on this side of the continent. And we have Jim Vivencio, who's a senior counsel at Perkins Coie. Is that? Coie, Person Coie. Okay, and he watches very closely the flows of money laundering, other kind of flows, and so we're looking forward to learning from them all as we go forward. So I'll invite everybody to make an initial presentation, and then we will have a discussion amongst us, and then we'll take some questions. So let me start off by our virtual participant who's joined us from Mexico City, Dr. Benitez. If you'd like to offer some thoughts, I think you're going to talk a little bit about fentanyl flows, if I understand correctly.
Buenos días, embajador.
Good morning to you all, Ambassador. Thank you very much for this introduction. I thank you very much also for the invitation from the director of the Wilson Institute at the Wilson Center to be able to return to my alma mater in Washington. I was there many years ago. That was in 1988 and also in 2003, and I feel very related to the history of the Institute and congratulations for the work that you carry out. I would like to continue with this conversation that Ambassador Wayne introduced and he mentioned in terms of these election campaigns that we have in both countries and the problem to identify two very conflictive issues in the bilateral relation. It has to do with drugs and also in drugs. It has to do with fentanyl on the US side, and also we have a defensive concern from the Mexican government in terms of complaints and ties from government officials with drug traffickers. And within this campaign elections, this has to do with years actually of being developed. These campaigns have led to polarization in terms of the discussion, which is also normal in all campaigns in countries, but this has to do with also polarization on a bilateral level. In the US, has, based on chemical drug deaths, fentanyl and others, more than 100,000 deaths a year. Mexico, on the other hand, has violence-related crimes, more than 30,000 victims a year. This is exactly, demographically speaking, the same proportion in terms of quantity, in terms of these figures. And so the US has 3 times more population, so it has 3 times more victims of fentanyl in this case. The threats are different because one has to do with violence, with bullets, and the other one has to do with the affection to the human bodies of people that are weak, that consume these drugs, fentanyl in particular, but the social effect or impact is the same. Now, last year, in 2023, that was the year of fentanyl for the bilateral diplomacy. We had a bilateral committee come in place that handled or that has had 6 meetings since it was built in last year, and there are workforces that have been working on fentanyl and on also weapons, trafficking of arms, and also on corruption cases. Also, with this bilateral agreement between the US and Mexico, we have also China. China didn't recognize being part of the problem, but then it went to the Los Angeles meeting and it finally accepts the dialogue with the US and it also accepts part of its responsibility. But for China, this has more to do with diplomacy. China has no problems with fentanyl consumption. This has to do with the control of companies that manufacture these chemicals. And their argument is that many of these companies are from other countries. These are transnational companies, even European, US companies, pharmaceutical companies, chemical companies that are private and that produce these chemicals illegally and that export illegally. And then we also have Canada added to the picture with a similar affection compared to Mexico and the US in terms of fentanyl consumption. 9,000 deaths in Canada, but then because of the population of Canada, 40 million inhabitants, it's the same proportion in the end. So we have a new problem with drug trafficking. And in addition to this, this has been addressed also by the candidates, but much more by the US candidates. Then we also have a different problem that has to do with the discourse. We've seen this 4 years ago of the most likely Republican candidate, ex-president or former President Donald Trump, who is a candidate whose campaign issues are polarizing. And he is also activating once again this discourse or discussion, blaming illegal or undocumented immigration from the South, basically. And his allies are, for example, the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, who is harder, even tougher than Trump in his policies. The border has 4 states, 4 border states with the US. One is very cooperative, California, but one that is very negative in terms of collaboration or cooperation is Texas. This is also an issue because we also have to deal with the state policies in the US. And as we all know, the US is a very federalized country, and this generates tension. Then we also have issues that have to do with the Mexican side that are also being introduced in the campaign, accusations of high-level government officials of corruption. And so in Mexico, we have a nationalist discourse against the US that has been launched. And right now, this has been so for 5 years now. It concentrates on blaming US agencies that intervene in Mexico. And the bad guy is, of course, the DEA. The DEA is cataloged as an agency that intervenes without or beyond the policies of the Biden administration, violating the Mexican laws. And there's a perception in public opinion moved by the government having a very important president. The president has more than 50% support from the population, and with an anti-US discourse and blaming US agencies such as the DEA to intervene in Mexico, and they have intervened in certain historic periods of of Mexico. So we have a scenario that has confrontational discourse in these elections, in these campaigns, and in the Mexican candidates, they have been very moderate and haven't used this conflictive discourse. Biden has also been very moderate. This is a moderate president, but then candidate Trump and his way of working and to gain more adepts is confrontation, and this can also provide a discourse of conflict that's very important in these years. And so immigration is also an issue since the period of George Bush. This has also been an issue in the 21st century also, but we hope that this doesn't affect our relation and also in these campaign periods, because we know that immigration has increased a lot, but many of these migrants are not Mexican anymore. Most of them come from many parts of the world, from China, Nigeria, Brazil, and from many other South American countries. There is an increase in immigration in Mexico that wants to cross Mexico, but then they stay in Mexico, even if they want to go to the US, Cubans, Venezuelans, even from Africa or Asia. And this then also becomes a very conflictive issue in elections or electoral campaigns. However, and I was asked to talk 5 minutes to open the debate, there are positive elements in the bilateral relation that can be strengthened by certain candidates. I, for example, believe that Biden as candidate is a constructive candidate, and also both female candidates for the Mexican elections have a very positive discourse in relation to the US and not in terms of a conflict, in terms of the relation. But then we also have Trump as a candidate because of his natural or nature, his conflictive, and we will also may have the same discourse that we had 4 years ago. So it is sad to say that relation between the US and Mexico is reduced sometimes to immigration and fentanyl. The relation is much more complex than that. But then this is the public discourse that we have. Thank you very much, Ambassador Wayne, for your moderation. Thank you.
This could become a very hot topic in the campaign as coming up. We know that a number of Republicans have already called for using military force to go into Mexico after cartel leaders. So we'll see how this develops, but which makes it all the more important that the governments work together to reduce the flow of these drugs as we go forward. But let's talk a little bit about the flow of arms, and then we'll talk about the flow of money, which makes both flows possible after that. So please, Kathy.
Thank you. First, I do want to give a shout out to the Wilson Center for convening this security conference. I think it's very important and vital. They also co-hosted a panel at the North Capitol Forum in Mexico City last October, and that was a closed session, but sort of the main themes that arose from that was the need for continued cooperation and building of trust, because even with the bicentennial framework, there's a long way to go with developing that. And I think this conference is a clear pathway to developing that coordination and trust amongst players. I also wanted to mention something that hit really close to home. I just felt I had to. But 2 weeks ago, a colleague of mine lost his wife in Tulum, who was vacationing there. She was caught between the crossfire of two narco traffickers. And for me, that just really brings home. We had traveled together to the San Diego-Tijuana border a year before, working on some of our research for the report I'll mention here. And at that time, one of the things that became clear as we interviewed, for example, Border Patrol, was that the Border Patrol was allowed to, and this is on the San Diego-Tijuana border, really look at illicit drugs and counterfeit money, but they were lacking intelligence and information that would help them with targeting illicit arms going across the border. So I just had to give a shout out to my colleague for his good work in that area and the loss of his life. And then I wanted to mention that I have co-authored a report under the auspices of the Pacific Council for International Policy out in Los Angeles. And just to correct the ambassador, I have moved back to the East Coast. So I'm now living not far from Richmond, Virginia. So it's kind of nice to be back home and also to have more access to the Hill and to others that are really working tirelessly on this issue of trying to reduce illicit trade in U.S. guns to Mexico.
Welcome back.
Thank you. It's really nice to be back. In the report that I co-authored, which is called the U.S.-Mexico Double Fix, because there's clearly both countries have to do a lot in order to meet the challenge. I think we often think of U.S. guns going to Mexico and the impact, but there's clearly other areas that are of concern in the security realm, and that is the diversion of weapons in Mexico from security forces, and also the involvement of security forces using a lot of the guns that are exported from the U.S. So there are two sides, right, to this problem, and it's not just the impact of U.S. guns to Mexico, although that is one of the predominant concerns. So in this report that I co-authored, there's 30 recommendations for all stakeholders, including governments, all the way to the gun industry and civil society. So I'll only be able to give a few highlights here in the sort of few minutes that I have. But I think what has already been done well is the framing of the issue, the stakes that are clearly involved here. And those stakes, as we know, include not only drug trafficking abuses, but also overdose deaths in the United States. There's also the undermining of legitimate government authority in Mexico. And that is clearly what this firepower from the US is. It's creating that permissive environment for that. There is the facilitation of the historic levels of violence, which we've all talked about, not just the homicides, but the disappeared. And then anyone who woke up to news reports today know that 2 mayoral candidates were killed in Mexico today by firearms. There are 5 of the most dangerous cities in the world in Mexico. And again, this is predominantly from armed violence. The stakes in terms of what is impacting the US is that about 70%, it's very hard to quantify the flow of illicit weapons across the US border. I'm not one who likes to quantify, but we can refer to official reports that do exist. And there's upwards from 70 to 80% of the firearms recovered from crime scenes in Mexico that are of US origin. Again, we only have the data that that Mexico government is providing for tracing to the US. So there may be crime scenes where the Mexico government is not reporting, for example, certain data. Let's say if a security force is using a legally imported weapon. So there's still a little bit of lack of transparency and accountability around that issue, and it's critical to talk about that as well. But the vast majority of guns found at crime scenes in Mexico come from the US. Additionally, again, with the data that we have from e-tracing or tracing from the US in cooperation with US authorities, we know that there are anywhere from 200,000 to 700,000 guns crossing each year. That means that it, sort of the low end is 500 a day, the high end is 2,000 a day. But clearly, again, we can't really quantify. There's so much that is not in our view because of the lack of forensics or the fact that they're smuggled and not seized. But the figures are tremendously high, right? Particularly coming from one source. So I've looked at arms trafficking all around the globe, and I'm astounded by the rate of US illicit flows to Mexico. Now, since we're talking about illicit trade, I just wanted to give you kind of throw out there for discussion what makes this propensity of this illicit trade feasible. And first, there needs to be a great understanding that there's a great number of US manufacturers in the US, and that makes it very difficult for regulatory control. It's the sheer number of gun stores in the US. So there's more gun stores in the US than Starbucks, McDonald's, and Subway combined. That's a huge number if you think of what law enforcement needs to do in order to stay on top of illicit activity. There's also a vast number of stolen guns in the US, so we have a very high percentage. That's why there's a lot of efforts to get more safe storage of firearms, and then a lot of some of the crime guns are coming from guns that have been stolen. There's also a large number of straw buyers. So that is when someone purchases a gun on behalf of another person in order for that gun or those guns to be trafficked across the border. There is the lack of regulation at gun shows, private sales, and online. Again, that makes it difficult for law enforcement when they're trying to devise strategies to interdict or seize. The vast majority of guns in Mexico come from 4 states. That is Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, and California. And so the US government has been concentrating its efforts on investigations and targeting illicit firearms trafficking in these areas. But again, it's astounding that most of the crime guns come from this area. There are also European arms companies and other international companies that have come to the US, open subsidiaries in order to export to Mexico, or whose guns are also found as crime guns in Mexico. And the reason for their coming to the US is because there's less regulation here. And so they have been exploiting this loophole. And then there's a sense, at least amongst the Mexicans, which we'll talk about a little bit in terms of the lawsuit they filed against gun manufacturers in the US, that there is a purposeful marketing and potentially distribution to organized crime networks. And lastly, the gun lobby in the US, I think, creates a self-interested narrative that more guns are needed to create more security. And I'll talk in a minute about how that has not worked for Mexico in the past. The good news is that there have been developments with the bicentennial framework. So it's still in its infancy, and we can expect, right, that there might still be a lot of room for improvement. But one little note for me, or one thing that I find really relevant here, is that before the bicentennial framework became the Working Cooperation Security Agreement between US and Mexico, Mexico had filed a lawsuit against gun manufacturers in the US. So that was in August, and then the bicentennial framework really took off in October of 2021. Why that's relevant is because when the bicentennial framework came out with its action plan, for the first time, combating guns trafficking was a central plank. That's very important because it commits both sides to tackling this very important issue. Now, I would say that based on my interviews with a lot of Mexican officials, there has been concern that the US has not done enough to follow through on this plank. That at high-level meetings, they are talking more specifically about drug trafficking and migration, which are critical issues, obviously, to the US, and less about guns, even though the Mexican officials continue to really provide a lot of very strong forensic data pointing to the problem. So again, there's a lot of room for attention to this matter, but at least it's a plank in the bicentennial framework, a top priority. And so Mexico can use that as an opportunity to push the US for greater control. I think Mexico officials for a large part, have been concerned that the U.S. is not looking at arms trafficking or the illicit trade in guns. They're looking at it mostly through a lens of arms trafficking and not looking at it through a lens of a supply chain problem. And what that means is they're looking at smugglers on the border that they can catch, but less often they're looking at upstream. And the concern has been, for example, when there's political will, or I would say when there is political will, the U.S., for example, has been pushing Mexico to go after, and has even created a larger international approach to looking at the precursor chemicals that are being used to produce fentanyl. So that is where the U.S. has taken a lead on going after supply chains. But the feeling and the sentiment, what I find in Mexico, is that the U.S. is not doing enough of the same to go after its own original sources of the weapons, and that they're very similar to what we've experienced with the opioid problem, that often the gun manufacturers and dealers and suppliers know when their weapons are going downstream to illicit actors. They're often given this information from ATF when ATF is tracing weapons on behalf of Mexico. So there's clearly knowledge base there amongst the gun industry. But the gun industry, again, is protected in a way that the pharmaceutical companies were not, because of legislation in the United States, which shields the gun companies from liability. That again is why Mexico has advanced a case in the US. Just last month, we had a ruling in the case of Mexico versus Smith & Wesson against the gun manufacturers. An appeals court allowed for it to move forward. So those are some of the, I think, high-level issues. There are still key issues that continue to be raised. They are the need for more extensive tracing, the need for the U.S. to clamp down on assault rifles, and particularly 50 caliber rifles, which are found more and more often. There's a lack of federal firearm licensees inspections in the U.S., which is also a problem that should be surmounted if this problem is going to be addressed. There's a need for more targeted border inspections. Currently, there are only targeted inspections at key ports of entry, but not all. There's a need under the bicentennial framework for metrics. Neither side is really working with metrics to demonstrate how they can show that they're making progress on this issue. And one of the key things that I've found on both sides of the border is that there's a lack of understanding of what the jurisdictions and the functionality is of all the various different agencies that are addressing the illicit trade, and that some form of mapping would be useful.
Thank you very much. Okay, Jim, tell us a little bit about all this money that's flowing around invisibly.
Sure. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. My name is Jim Vivenzio, and I spent 32 years with the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and I was their director for BSA AML policy. Essentially, I spent my entire career, all 32 years when I was in government, in the fraud and AML space. So I've really seen how this area has just continually evolved, especially with technology, and now we're getting away from cash into virtual currencies, and it's really been a fascinating process to see. With regard to anti-money laundering, the one thing that I've also seen is it's like the flow of water. It goes to the point of least resistance, where those financial institutions that have the weakest controls are the ones that are impacted. I came to Washington in 2000, right before 9/11, and saw the growth and expansion of the anti-money laundering laws into the terrorist area, anti-terrorism area, and was involved in drafting those regulations. My perspective on Mexico as a bank regulator is, there is a lot of cooperation going on between the federal banking agencies and the Mexican banking agencies, and that went on throughout my entire career, and it was very impressive, the level of communication and cooperation. But throughout my regulatory career at the OCC, there were very impactful events that occurred concerning, Mexico and the money laundering typologies. Between 2008 and 2012, there were enormous enforcement cases that were brought against some of the biggest money center banks, involving accounts with some of the Mexican financial institutions. And the penalties, involved in those cases were unprecedented. It went into the billions of dollars. As a result, Mexico saw the writing on the wall with regard to some of the unintended consequences of these enforcement cases is what's known as de-risking, where financial institutions lose their U.S. correspondent relationships. And so, after all those big cases took place, Mexico took the courageous step of amending their laws to actually restrict U.S. currencies to certain dollar values, and I think that went a long way in ensuring that U.S. financial institutions didn't de-risk Mexico, as was happening with many other geographic areas. After the de-risking issue, then we had actually de-risking taking place in the United States, where there was de-risking along the southwest border, where farmers, that basically, were selling goods in Mexico, were losing their bank accounts and banking relationships, and it had a huge impact. And I believe it was 2018, the GAO released a study trying to figure out what was going on the southwest border. So these are some of the unintended consequences you get with these AML laws, is you get, de-risking of entire countries. You get de-risking of regions in the United States where U.S. companies and citizens, can't maintain banking relationships. And then the third major issue with the AML laws that we also see is a humanitarian crisis, where because of certain sanctions requirements in certain geographies, it's difficult, if not impossible, to get humanitarian aid into those regions that need the assistance. So just wanted to point that out. On the money laundering front, Treasury 2 weeks ago just issued its 2024 National Money Laundering Risk Assessment. I'd encourage everybody interested in this space, take a look at that. It kind of lays out all the threats and vulnerabilities. What I found interesting about this risk assessment is, throughout my career, the money laundering typologies always seem to emphasize, south of the border. Interestingly, and I just did a quick, dirty analysis of these risk assessments, and they come out every 2 years. The first one came out in 2015. And since 2015, there were 85 references to Mexico in the risk assessment, 3 references to China, 9 references to Russia. This current risk assessment has essentially 35 references to Mexico, so down nearly 60%. 62 references to China, up nearly 2,000%, and 88 references to Russia, up nearly 900%. So, and that's in a 9-year time period, and I found that interesting because it clearly shows a change in focus of the Treasury Department that issues this Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, to focus more on a more global perspective to money laundering, because that's really what's happening right now. China is involved in the fentanyl trade. This report indicates that the chemicals and the manufacturing tools are being shipped from China to Mexico, and the fentanyl is being produced in Mexico and then coming across the borders. The report also indicates that there's also terrorism. There have been, attempts by known terrorists to also cross the border through this human smuggling that's taking place by these criminal organizations. I wanted to point that out. The risk assessment also gets into, the main threats, and the threats it gets into are frauds, corruption, drug trafficking, cybercrime, the money laundering networks professionally, human trafficking and smuggling, tax crimes, and wildlife and nature crimes. Second section gets into the vulnerabilities and the risks, including cash, financial products, legal entities, virtual entities, compliance deficiencies, luxury and high-value goods, casinos, gaming, and entities not covered by AML requirements, including investment advisors, payment processors, attorneys, and accountants. Interestingly, this risk assessment has 5 pages just devoted to attorneys, and I thought that was interesting. The previous one from 2022 essentially devoted 1 paragraph to attorneys. So it looks like there's going to be some regulation forthcoming, but I just want to end by pointing out a lot is happening right now in my area in the AML space. There's a new law called the Corporate Transparency Act that just went into effect on January 1st, and it requires non-exempt legal entities to report their beneficial ownership to FinCEN. It's a huge undertaking. If any of you in the room own a limited liability company, you've got to file these reports by January 1st of next year. There's also going to be, FinCEN just proposed this past month, I should say within the past 2 weeks, proposed rules to regulate investment advisors to essentially address the money laundering risks taking place through, basically private equity. There's also been a proposed rule the past few weeks, in real estate transactions that involve cash that's going to require the settlement agents to understand, who, and report, who are the beneficial owners behind these real estate transactions. FinCEN also proposed a rule in the antiques and antiquities area. The final rule hasn't come out yet, but there's so much happening in this space, to close the gaps and prevent, these money launderers and identify them, when the laundering takes place. And this evolution is continuing. The risk assessment gets into, some of the traditional money laundering methods, including, funnel accounts from multiple banks in the U.S. to a single bank account in the border. It also gets into the traditional methods of bulk cash smuggling, taking the cash over the border, which was essentially what those, 2008 to 2012 cases involved. Ultimately, what happened is, again, it evolves. In 2010, when we put those cases together, we saw everything was happening in a bank. We were able to see the entire typology right before us and develop that money laundering typology of bulk cash repatriation smuggling. Now, there were 3 components to it. You had the wire, you had the cash services going to the Federal Reserve, and you had the check clearing and the check processing. So now what's happened is all of those activities have now moved outside the bank. You now have these third-party processors that are doing all of the check processing on behalf of banks. You now actually have these cash, vaults, third-party cash vaults that are vaulting cash on behalf of banks. So it's all moving away from banks, and it's making it more difficult for banks to really see, what's going on out there and put these typologies together. So it's just a continue evolution, and it's really up to the regulators and the officials to stay on top of this, and it's a very challenging task.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim. Very sadly, those threats were all quite evident when I was ambassador in Mexico, and it's taken a long time to get people to act on these things. I'm glad they are, and they're shifting their attention. And just recently, there was a report by Reuters saying about 7.5% of remittances are probably also tied to cartels, and that was $65 billion last year in remittances. So there's a lot of money flowing around there, and we have not been able to find it for all the reasons that you mentioned. These are smart people, and they hire smart people to figure out how to send their money back.
And the remittances are low dollar values. Yeah, so it's
Right.
it's very hard to detect. And one of the things that I've been pushing, throughout my career, just has been through the use of technology. These new AI systems and things like that, can really make a difference in the sophistication of the ability of financial institutions to identify these kind of threats.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, part of the problem was all of our institutions were just overwhelmed by the suspicious reports, money reports they had to use to find, and we couldn't even sort through those reports from banks and things.
Yeah.
So you're exactly right. I think that's a place where AI can help. Well, let's talk for a few minutes about each of these. Let me start off asking, and Doctor, maybe you would like to comment on this first. What do you think are a couple of steps that could actually help slow, I won't say eliminate, the flow of fentanyl? And what do you think are a couple of steps that could overcome this mistrust, which you referred to, which has been evident during this whole administration in Mexico, mistrust of U.S. agencies, which makes it very, very hard to have serious investigations that are cross-border investigations? What do you think could help open this up? And then I'll invite comments from both of you too, please.
Eh, Ambassador, I think, en español, yo creo que los
I believe in
políticos
Spanish that politicians from the US and from Mexico also have to take a step forward and to forget these accusations and to work jointly. That's what they have to do, because all countries, all governments have certain failures. They are failed states in terms of the control of their customs, in the control of firearms and the sales of firearms in the US, for example. China is not controlling the manufacturing plants, and Mexico doesn't control their borders, their customs. And the movements of fentanyl, and through their border, the US doesn't control their entry points. And so there should be also cooperation also with Canada, and we have to stop with the accusations because they are all failing in terms of their responsibilities. All governments are failing in their responsibilities. And the problem with fentanyl is that it's much easier to transport it than cocaine or than marijuana or than any other drug, because the pills are very small and they can be transported by any individual. And in the borders, many US citizens and also Mexican citizens, they have small bags of fentanyl in their bags with their clothes, and this is not detected by the customs authorities. Dogs that smell drugs at the borders are not working correctly because pills are with aluminum packages of medicines. And so instead of accusing themselves, US accusing China, Mexico accusing the US, etc., they should be rather try to improve these controls, and the US agencies or the overall government agencies should be careful with these accusations. That's what I believe that should be happening, Mr. Ambassador.
Would you like to make some comments on that question? 2 or 3 steps that could help deal with fentanyl flows and could rebuild cooperation, trust, let's say, that we have a little bit rebuilt, but not as much as we need to do.
Just something to point out with the illicit trade in guns and drugs, I find that there is, in both countries, there has been a predominant tackling of this issue from a law enforcement perspective. And so one of the ways that I think could sort of move both sides further is to look at it more from a national security perspective, more of an intelligence gathering, more of a the U.S. likes to use the word whole of government approach, but I do find kind of in both of these areas that it has been largely predominantly law enforcement rather than at a higher critical level where I think things could become more useful. And then the other issue is just really resources. I think the U.S. sometimes has felt that it's provided a lot of resources to Mexico in the past, and that has led to some sort of misplays with the kingpin strategy, with the militarization of public security, and when it came to guns, the kind of sting operations and gun walking, Fast and Furious, for example, that didn't work. And so the emphasis now is, can we build more also at a subnational level, at a granular level, but at the same time, high level intelligence sharing and coordination?
Yeah, one area that's been very effective in the anti-money laundering space is the development of an international group known as the FATF, or the Financial Action Task Force. And the FATF actually evaluates every country every 10 years and gives them a rating as to the strength of their controls, AML controls. And it's been very effective, because those countries that are designated by FATF as having weak controls, really have problems, economically and globally in getting, their correspondent banking relationships and things like that. In fact, some countries, when they're designated, U.S. banks can't provide them with services, and it's been very, very effective. And I think that type of global coordination here is necessary, because, like, as I pointed out earlier, this isn't just a Mexico problem. This is a global problem. These supplies, are coming, from other areas, and this has to be addressed and tackled on a more global basis, from my perspective. Similar to the use of, an entity like the FATF that does in fact go out there and examine countries. In fact, the U.S. is being examined again next year. The FATF examiners are coming in, and they're looking at, all U.S. industries and how effective the controls that the U.S. has in place. And when we get dinged by the FATF, that's what results in change. And that's the reason why we've got these new investment advisor rules. The FATF has identified that as a deficiency in our program. The real estate rules, the FATF identified that, and it proved to be a very effective mechanism.
I agree. It has. I used to work on that, and yes, I agree fully that it does. The problem is when some countries are less enthusiastic about actually applying the recommendations that are made. Shifting a little bit to what you were saying, Kathy, about the lack of metrics and action plans, which is true not only for arms, but it's true in the entire high-level security dialogue process. Very sadly, they agreed on objectives. They never agreed on actual specific action plans or metrics for doing this. But let me ask a more basic question. You talked a lot about what the U.S. isn't doing. So why doesn't Mexico actually check cars coming into the United States? There's no checks on the Mexican side of the border to try and find these arms. Why is that? And that has gone on. I raised it when I was ambassador, so over 10 years ago. And the Mexicans they're very serious about complaining to us, but they're not willing to put people on their side of the border to actually check. Why is that?
Very good question. And that question is often raised at the technical level on the border. So when I have been interviewing Border Patrol, that they feel sometimes the onus is on them. And why can't Mexico do more? Because it is, after all, the guns impacting Mexico. But clearly, the number one answer to that question is a resource issue. The U.S. has far more resources to apply than the Mexican government does. There is also the concern around corruption and the co-opting of security forces on the border. So internally in Mexico, there's concern about what security forces will be effective in actually monitoring the border. So I think those are kind of the critical issues, the resource issue. The U.S. has far more. But again, it is weapons that are coming from the U.S. that, the U.S. has a responsibility in terms of getting better control over its supply chain. And then on the Mexico side, I think there is some granular level cooperation on the borders, but really there is a lack of attentiveness. And then also with the migration issue being so overwhelming, and that a lot of the security apparatus being used to address the migration issue which the U.S. has basically asked Mexico to take on that issue for a large part, is a reason why Mexico hasn't really extended a lot of these resources at the border.
Well, I just have to add,
Yeah.
I think you might know, we offered actually to pay for scanners on their side of the border, and they refused to accept it.
That's right.
Because of
There's
that mistrust that the doctor mentioned earlier,
Mhm.
coming from the current government in Mexico.
Absolutely. And then there is a lot of technological improvements that could be there. It's the lack of trust, as we mentioned, the lack of cooperation in this area, but there are also other global actors involved. So China wanting to put scanners at the border or provide technological improvements. So I think there's a lot more than just Mexico refusal, but also Mexico having other actors and stakeholders that the U.S. needs to be concerned about as well.
Okay. They actually turned down the China, they did
Yeah,
not buy
they
the
did.
Chinese
Exactly.
scanners at the border, though they might have some imports already. Okay, so what would you like to see as the focus for really getting a better handle on all this money that's flowing around? I mean, there are a bunch of different initiatives going on that are very important. Are there two or three that you think would be might be the most effective in trying to find some of this money that's swashing around, or you think it's going to just have to be developing these 5 to 10 initiatives that the U.S. is now working on more seriously?
Yeah, sadly, in the financial area, we're also impacted by funding. The Congress passed, the AML Act of 2020, went effective on January 1st of 2021, and we're now in, 2024, and, just getting some of these proposed rules issued now. I mean, it's taken 3 years. It's going to take, how much more time to get these final rules issued. And so that's been a big problem, has been, funding of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, so that they can essentially get these rules out quicker. There's a lot going on. There are going to be a lot more proposed rules coming out, under the AML Act of 2020, that are important for this entire framework. And yet, it's already been 3 years since enactment, and we're still waiting for the final for these final rules to come out. So it's a funding issue. Assuming all of the rules that are contemplated in the AML Act of 2020, ultimately come out, and it's working as it should. I think it'll go a long way in addressing many of these financial areas and vulnerabilities and things like that. The new challenge that's coming up is in the decentralized finance and virtual currency space. And the AML Act also addresses those areas, and FinCEN's also coming out with new rules. They just issued a proposal with regard to tumblers and mixers that would require an entire new reporting regime on the part of virtual asset service providers that will require them to report any transactions in the virtual currency space that touch a mixer. And they just came out with that rule proposal in October. And a mixer is essentially I should say, a smart contract or a method of obscuring the source of virtual currency. So somebody can basically submit their virtual currency into a mixer, and that individual who put it into the mixer is then completely anonymized with regard to where that virtual currency goes. So it basically takes a chunk of virtual currency and then disperses it in multiple ways to obscure the ultimate where those funds are going. Makes it very difficult for law enforcement to trace that virtual currency. So I was heartened to see FinCEN getting into these types of areas, because ultimately ransomware is a huge problem. I don't know if you all recall, about a year and a half ago, the entire, northeast region of the United States, their oil was disrupted through a ransomware attack. And essentially what FinCEN's been finding is those ransomware attacks are directly tied to these mixers, and the mixers are just making it very difficult for law enforcement to trace the virtual currencies that are required in these ransomware attacks. So this is going to be the new challenge, is going to be in this, virtual currency decentralized finance space. And the fraudsters are right on top of these areas. They have expertise, and they're going to use it to the best of their ability.
Right. No, that's very interesting. They're finding new ways to move things around.
Yeah.
And one thing we haven't mentioned yet tonight, but today, but just to mention, is the use of sanctions that the Biden administration has started over the last year and a half, of more vigorous use of sanctions in fentanyl supply chains. They just issued a set of sanctions on human smuggling and transportation, including bus companies and other companies, which is another tool that they have, but it takes work. Also, OFAC has to do all the homework to develop sanctions, and then you have to apply the sanctions. So it all takes a lot of work and takes people power to get it done. Are there any questions from the audience, either the virtual audience or the in-person audience? Embajadora.
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Vicencio. Is it feasible to think about the possibility of eliminating cash and then making
If you could offer the microphone for the translation, please.
Is it feasible? Yes, it's feasible, but the big problem is the privacy component. For there to be a national virtual currency, there's the fear that the government is going to be able to see every one of your transactions. And so, that's one of the challenges, that there are these, currently there are these groups that are looking into trying to figure out if it's possible to have a national virtual currency, whether or not there could be some sort of an encryption, that would essentially block the ability to see through the transactions on the part of the government, and apparently they've got the technology to do that, but the encryption slows down the transaction too much. So the technology isn't there yet that would enable a national virtual currency to be, private. And that's, I think that's where this is going, and that's what folks are working towards, is trying to figure out a way to encrypt virtual currencies. And then there's also the example of China, where China does have like a national type virtual currency, but folks are concerned about how that's being used in terms of
But what's
privacy.
wrong with the government looking at all your transactions? What's wrong with that? That's the only way to find out who is doing illegal things.
Yeah, well, that's there's been a history of privacy in this country. In 1970, I believe, almost 50 years ago, almost half a century ago, there was a law passed. It was called the Right to Financial Privacy Act. And the Right to Financial Privacy Act has been, a part of this country's fabric, for almost half a century now. And people expect a level of privacy with respect to their financial transactions. And so I think that's the issue. It's kind of, I think it's embedded in our ethos and in our culture here in the U.S. I mean, it's been around for a half a century.
As strong as the right to carry arms?
I just want to add that one of the reasons that the Financial Intelligence Unit, the WIF in Mexico, is less efficient is because of exactly the same concern. They could not get the law changed to allow the government to see everybody's private financial assets, because individuals who were elected, i.e. members of Congress, did not trust the government to have access to all of that information. And as you remember, there have been a number of instances where it might have looked like the WEF was doing things for political ends and targeting certain people. And I think that just reinforced the fear among a number of Mexicans that they weren't sure that they could trust their government either at this point. Hopefully we can get to a trustworthy point, but I don't think we're quite there yet in either country, I just add. Other questions, please.
Thank you. I'm Pablo Ampudia. Thank you very much for this panel. Super interesting. And well, the first question I have is for you, Ms. Austin. And well, despite the existence of several frameworks, the Merida Initiative, the Bicentennial Framework, we continue to observe heightened levels of violence, drug consumption, overdose, etc. And well, in light of this fact, do you see the need of transitioning to a new framework, more creative framework that truly integrates and harmonizes laws, policies, institutions between Mexico and the US? And secondly, what do you see as the biggest challenge to overcome the distrust between both governments, particularly in the context of the 2024 elections? And secondly, if I may, for Mr. Vicencio, well, given that cartels continue to transition to, well, to diversify their sources of revenue and now move to illicit economies, trading of avocados, lemons, etc. Are there any mechanisms to trace and tackle, well, that money and, well, impede that it ends up in the cartels' pockets? Thank you very much.
There's some easy questions.
Yeah, well, the bicentennial framework is only a couple years old. And so if we push forward some of the things we're talking about here, about mapping, about creating metrics, about creating action plan, I think it's very difficult to go back to the beginning now. And from my perspective, we do have combating arms trafficking as a first major plank in the security framework. So as a, a person looking seriously at those issues and how we can address them, I think it's really relevant. I will say that there is also the problem, right, of changes of administration. So both countries are going to be going through changes of administration, and we don't quite know what that's going to augur. But there has been a number of huge developments, and one of the things is the Bipartisan Safety Community Act, right, in the U.S., which for the first time created made straw purchasing and arms trafficking a federal crime. And already the number of traffickers and the number of prosecutions going forward, since that's only about a year old, has already escalated quite a bit. So you can see that there is now legislation moving in that direction. There is also elevated resources, but with with changes in administration, right? Or possible changes in administrations coming up in the election year, we don't quite know, right, where this might go forward. The problem in the U.S. obviously is the political, cultural, and constitutional issues around gun ownership and the protection of the gun industry. And I think that's really where civil society, legislation, and a tough administration really has to act in the future on the U.S. side. On the Mexico side, I think the ambassador was alluding to the fact that, yes, transnational organized crime networks control a lot of the border areas. And that is something that Mexico is going to have to get a handle on. They're going to have to do more on the prosecutorial level. They're going to have to build greater capacity in their own judiciary institutions and better relationships between security forces, judiciary, and other institutions within Mexico. So there's lots of room for improvement within the framework itself. But I would say on the arms issue, what we have now is that it's combating illicit arms is a key plank.
So Jim, Doctor, would you each like to maybe add a couple thoughts as we wrap up?
Sure, just to address the question you had raised. with regard to legitimate businesses, generally when a bank has a legitimate business account, it can identify that business is legitimate. Either based on outliers in volumes, the bank should also be able to see, the legitimate expenses coming in for that particular business. One of the things that we would sometimes see would be a business opening up, only a receipts account at a bank, and then their expense account would be somewhere else. And so the banker really didn't get a comprehensive view of that relationship. And that's not good from an AML perspective, if a customer's coming to you and they're only going to give you part of their business and the other part's over here, you're not able to put it all together, that creates risks to the bank, to the financial institution. The other thing we also saw was we saw legitimate businesses that were essentially hijacked by the fraudsters through threats that if you don't launder our money, there's going to be harm to you or your family. That was another big problem that we sometimes identified, when I was in government. And then the third thing I'll just point out is, this new law that was just passed, the Corporate Transparency Act, that requires reporting. Doesn't just require reporting of domestic corporations, but if you are a foreign business and you register to do business in a particular U.S. state, you also have to file a beneficial ownership report with FinCEN, so that essentially you have to disclose your ownership to the federal government. So I think that's going to help. Who's behind these entities? Are they legitimate entities? As opposed to what we saw with the Panama Papers, where you had all these shell companies and nobody was able to figure out what was happening with these entities.
Yeah, I think you're right on there, Jim. Doctor, any closing thoughts you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I want to talk about the organization of the criminal groups. The strategy of the both governments to try to dismantle the organizations by the leaders is not working very well, because they work as a business company, and they have many different parts of the organization. And this, we can see this during the COVID crisis. During the COVID crisis, the migration issues were stopped. We don't have any people moving from Guatemala to the United States, and the criminal organizations goes to the extortion, business activities in Mexico City, etc., etc., etc. And also in Mexico, the government works differently depending on the state, or depending on or the branch of the government to attack criminal organizations. And because of this, we have success in Mexico City, for example, in Yucatan, for example, etc. But we can see failures in some parts of the border. For example, in Monterrey, the government works very well, but not in Chihuahua, not in Baja California. At the same time, the criminal organizations are opening the border of Guatemala to his activities, to cross people and to cross drugs. And right now, some people are talking about the migrant business is more important than the drug business in Mexico for the criminal organizations.
Well, thank you. Those are very important. And it reminds me of one issue we haven't yet gotten into. It just shows how much more there is to talk about, which is impunity.
Yeah.
You could have wonderful laws, but if you don't enforce those laws and bring people to justice, and if you look at some of the rankings that have been done of states in Mexico, you find a whole bunch of states with over 90% impunity rates, and some up at 98, 99%, which is just what you're saying. There's a big variation among states and the federal government of what's your chance. That I think the national average is 94% impunity.
Yeah.
So that means you kill somebody, you get arrested, you've got 94% chance of not being convicted. And then you look at the other crimes too. So that's a problem that needs to be addressed also as we go forward. So we've touched on a whole bunch of important issues. I think we've just cracked open the door, and we'll look forward to having further conversations with you and with others as we go forward. Thank you very much for being with us today, everybody. And I don't know, Andrew, do you want to make some closing remarks for this session and another session tomorrow?
That's right. Thank you, Ambassador Wayne. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to our panel. Let's give them a round of applause. As I mentioned at the outset, we're focusing throughout our conference on both bilateral issues as well as domestic issues that apply specifically to Mexico. And as I mentioned, tomorrow we have a session where we will talk about the challenges that will face the next president of Mexico, with 3 experts who have done a lot of analysis of the security situation. So please join us tomorrow online at 3 p.m. Eastern for that. And again, thank you all for being here this morning in person and online, and we'll look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Thank you.